What was your family secret that you found out? Story 1. Turns out I have a black uncle. I didn't find out until my grandmother told my aunt in a semi-lucid moment while she was bedridden. No, it's not what you think. When my father was a kid, his family employed a black housekeeper, maid, servant, whatever you'd call it, who was around 16 or 17. My dad recalls that sometimes she'd bring her little brother to come by and play with him and his siblings. Then something happened. Apparently things were bad at home, or maybe the parents got in a car wreck. I think it was more the former, but I don't recall. Anyway, while the daughter was old enough to become emancipated, she wasn't going to be allowed to take custody of her younger brother, and he was going to be placed in foster care. So my grandfather called his lawyer friend and very quietly adopted the boy so he could continue living with his sister. Keep in mind, my grandfather was a doctor, and this was a small town in the rural South during the 1950s or 1960s. It likely would have been significantly damaging to his reputation had this been made public, hence the secrecy. Anyway, I never met the guy. The family hardly knows anything about him, though I know he has a family and is doing all right. So yeah, I have a black uncle, and my grandmother missed taking that secret to her grave by just a few months. Story 2. Me in a way, or who my dad was, depending on how you look at it. The details would take a while to type out, but essentially, my mom hid me from my dad and told me my entire life that he had died before I was born, to keep me from looking into it. She made up a random guy, provided pictures of him, but never of her with him, gave a story about how he died, and I spent 20 years never thinking to question it. Apparently, my dad and my grandmother would find ways to try and contact me, but my mom and my grandma on her side would shut it down and threaten them if they did. The whole thing is crazy. At 20, my dad found me on Facebook and told me the whole story, providing pictures of the two of us together when I was barely a toddler, as well as pictures of him with my mom. Apparently, they had a falling out, and my mom wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. My dad and I are very close now. The whole story is absolutely heartbreaking, especially for my dad's mom. She wanted to get to know me so desperately, and only did in the last 2 years she was alive. My dad and I text once a week, and it's pretty great when it happens. Story 3. My dad recently confessed to my sister and me that he likes to dress up as a woman and go out to bars with other men who enjoy the same thing. He even showed me pictures of himself. It's been bizarre to fully digest it all because it really never occurred to me, but I'm actually very relieved that he does that, since I thought he was very lonely and didn't have any friends. He went through a divorce, the death of both of his parents, and his company went bankrupt within 3 years, and he became very depressed at one point, which I'm pretty sure is what led him to go look for something else in life. I've been a very complicated son, and our relationship hasn't been the best lately, but I'm very happy that he found a place to feel comfortable in, and that he found the strength to confide in my sister and me. I'm also very happy that he knows he'll never be judged by us for the things he likes to do. Story 4. My grandpa's probably wanted for something serious in his country of birth. He was born in Armenia sometime before World War II. He refused to explain why, but he ended up in France under somewhat murky circumstances. He joined the French Foreign Legion under a fake name. His real first name is totally unknown to anyone alive today. The last person who knew it was my grandma, who died about 10 years ago. One of the last things she said to me was, "I never did like the fact he picked Jacques as his name. He was wounded during the war in Indochina and received French citizenship. A clause in the Legion's contract states that if you get wounded in the service of France, you get citizenship, and he got his papers in his assumed name." Fast forward to when I was in my early 20s and stationed in Europe with the military. I asked him if we had any family members still living in Armenia so I could visit them. He insisted I never go there or ever try to contact any of them. He died last year. Story 5. In the early 1900s, my great-grandparents immigrated to the U.S. from Italy. They lived in southern Illinois, my great-grandfather working in coal mines and my great-grandmother staying at home. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, the youngest being my grandfather. His brother, my great-uncle, was always said to be tall, thick-built, with a temper and a love for adventure. When my grandfather was still young, under the age of 10, if I remember correctly, his brother went missing. This wasn't really a cause for concern at first because he would occasionally hop on a train and head to Chicago or St. Louis just to see the city. Usually, he'd be gone for a week or two, then show back up. After almost a month, they knew something was wrong, but no one knew where to look. There were no Amber Alerts or missing persons networks to tap into. All they could do was wait and hope he would come back. A couple of months later, a letter showed up, not in the mail but nailed to the front door. It was from a group called the Black Hand. They had my great-uncle. They demanded a ransom. I don't know how much, but being a poor coal mining family, there was nothing they could do. It broke them. My great-aunt had a breakdown and spent the rest of her life in an institution. Both of my great-grandparents turned to alcohol. My grandfather would retreat to the woods to be alone, which eventually earned him the nickname Jungle. My grandfather told me this story once. He never looked at me the entire time he spoke. I knew he never told anyone this story besides his wife. My mother and her two sisters never heard it until I told them after my grandparents had passed. They never knew they had an uncle, let alone one who was taken by this group. I haven't thought about that story for a long time, probably close to 20 years. I wonder, and I know my grandfather always did too, what became of his brother? How did he get caught up with them? Was he a part of the Black Hand or just another victim? An old family question that will forever remain unanswered. Story 6. My grandpa served in World War II in the Pacific Theater. I'm not sure what his rank was. He was very closed off about talking about the war or even his family growing up. Every now and then he would open up, but it was one of those random things. He's 98 years old, so I can't even begin to imagine what he has gone through. One day my parents and my uncle were visiting him in the nursing home, and he mentioned something about the war. My dad always tries to see what he can get out of him, and after pushing a bit, he found out that my grandpa had been taken prisoner by the Japanese. He said the only reason he escaped was by pure chance. I can't begin to imagine what that was like or what he went through. Edit. I woke up this morning and remembered how the conversation started. My dad was saying his goodbyes for the day and asked my grandpa if he wanted him to turn off his lamp. My grandfather said no because he didn't like being in the dark. When my dad asked him why, he said, "When I was captured during the war, I was held inside a room with no light except a tiny pinhole." This was the first time my dad or my uncle had ever heard that. Story 7. It's my secret that opened up another. I was assaulted between the ages of 2 and 4 in an unbelievable number of ways and times by my stepbrother who was 8 years older than me. I confessed this, along with the fact that I was gay, to my dad's brother and his wife because they were my absolute closest, most trusted and loved family members. I was probably 18 or 19. My uncle started crying because he once walked in on my stepbrother wrestling with me, at least that's what he called it, while my stepsister, she's 4 years older, watched. It happened during a large family barbecue in New Jersey. He immediately told both of them to get off me and to go downstairs and hang out with the family. He said he just felt like he had walked in on something really terrible, even though we were both fully clothed. He wanted to comfort me but didn't know how, so he left me there crying. He was maybe 21 at the time. I harbor no resentment. My confession led him to share one of his own. He told me that he was abused as a boy too, and had only just started therapy, admitting it for the first time over 30 years later. He told me I was brave, but I told him he was braver, for holding it in and not letting it destroy his life. I was the only person other than his wife and therapist who knew at the time. I have a lot of respect for him. They are the only two immediate family members who believe me. It would destroy my grandmother, and my dad is still married to the stepbrother's mother, so when I told them, they first asked me if I was lying for attention, and when I said no, second, told me there was absolutely no way that happened because they would have noticed, and third, promptly forgot I said anything, probably because they were drunk, as usual. I wish I had gone into detail about just one of the many times it happened. I remember everything I was told, everything I was forced to do, everything I saw and smelled. If I shared even one of the thousands of flashbacks I experienced daily with them, maybe they'd stop calling to say, "Call your brother." I'm sure he misses you and probably has good advice since you both work in similar fields. Plus, he loves you. Yes, please continue to diminish my experience and remind me how much my brother loves me. Thank you. And they wonder why I moved across the country and rarely communicate with them anymore. Story 8. My grandfather had a family that he walked out on when he was younger. I don't know if he divorced his wife or just said he was going to get a pack of cigarettes and never came back, but apparently he just left one day. It was a secret he took to his grave. Until one day, a son from his previous marriage tracked down my aunt, called her, and asked to have dinner. My mom went with her. There he explained that he didn't want to disturb our family or cause any distress, but he was getting older and needed to know about my grandfather's medical history. He explained that my grandfather had been married to his mother, whose mental health was deteriorating, and that he probably left because he couldn't take it anymore, or something like that. He didn't have many or any real memories of my grandfather. Obviously, my mother and aunt were devastated. My grandfather had served honorably in the Korean War and was a pillar of his community. He was an accountant in a large Italian-American neighborhood, and many of his clients couldn't even pay him. They gave him pastries or whatever they could spare. When my grandmother asked about this, he told her he just couldn't turn people away. They needed help, and he was in a position to do the right thing. He was loved by everyone who knew him. He had no enemies, just people who admired him. He wasn't affectionate often, but when he was, it meant something. Now, this is particularly strange to me from a psychological standpoint, because my grandmother's own father walked out on her when she was young, leaving her to care for her ailing mother and siblings. My grandfather passed away from cancer almost 10 months before I was born. I'm named after him. My grandmother and my other aunt have no idea about any of this and never will. Only 4 people, including me, know the truth, and we have no intention of telling anyone else. It would devastate my grandmother. She never remarried and loved him more than anything. I don't know what to think of this man. I want to be angry for what he did, but he was such a wonderful father to my mom and aunts, and gave so much to his community. There are 2 conflicting versions of who he was. Story 9. That I have a half-brother who lived just 3 miles away from me my whole life. And the craziest part is how I found out. My grandma, who in hindsight I now realize had very backward views, got into an argument with my dad after saying something that hurt his feelings. My dad retaliated with something equally hurtful. I wasn't there for the altercation since I had just started college, but it apparently triggered some painful memories from my dad's childhood. From what I understand, my grandma was pretty verbally abusive to her 5 sons, and based on how my dad and uncles act, I believe it. That said, my dad definitely has his own issues and has caused our family some difficulties. But at the end of the day, I know he's a good person. He loves us and tries when he can. The argument between my dad and grandma dragged on for months and only worsened. My parents stopped visiting for holidays as we always had, and my siblings and I began visiting less too. I've got an older brother, we'll call him Tyler, about 21 at the time, and a younger sister, Ellie, around 13, who had a good relationship with grandma. But my dad and grandma are both incredibly stubborn. Neither wanted to apologize first, so they just stopped speaking. It was summer break. I was about to leave for a study abroad program halfway across the world, and I got a call from grandma while driving with my boyfriend to meet my mom and finalize some travel stuff. Grandma wanted to invite us to a 4th of July gathering. I had always felt a bit uneasy around her, so I didn't really mind that we were drifting apart. She started talking about food or something, and then casually began listing cousins who would be there. Then she said, "And your brother will be there too." I was confused. Why would she call Tyler your brother like that if we lived in the same house? So I said, "Oh, really? Tyler's going? Thanks for letting me know." And she replied, "Oh no, not Tyler. I'm talking about your other brother." I said, "Grandma, what are you talking about?" And she goes, "Well, your father, a long time ago, got another girl pregnant and had a boy. His name is Charlie, and he lives over by the Starbucks on Rose Street. He's got a family now and a precious little daughter. Your niece. He'll be at the 4th of July thing. Just thought you should know." I was in shock. 15 minutes later, I was sitting with my mom preparing for my trip. Then the whole situation spiraled. My extended family, cousins, uncles, and of course grandma, started forming a relationship with Charlie. They invited him to holidays and had gatherings at his place. I even went to meet him once, and he looked just like my dad. It was surreal. Some people ask why I don't want a relationship with him, or if I hold something against him. I don't. When I said I went to meet him out of curiosity, that was true. I also thought that maybe he was the one most hurt by all of this and might just want to connect. I felt angry at my father for letting Charlie live a separate life without acknowledgement. And yes, I couldn't help but feel like this was exactly what my grandmother wanted, to stir up drama. When I met him, it was coordinated through my uncle. We never spoke directly until I was at his house. The whole visit felt odd. It seemed like he had lived his life peacefully, and now, in his mid-30s, with a wife and kids, our side of the family was barging into his life. I didn't want to be another disruption unless he wanted me there. My gut told me that Grandma and my uncle were using Charlie to hurt my father, not to build family connections, so I chose not to push a relationship. Maybe he does deserve to be reached out to, but we've met now. I just don't want to cause more pain by assuming a relationship would benefit him or me. That feels presumptuous. Storytime. I should probably use a throwaway for this because it's still a secret, but I doubt anyone who cares is on Reddit. I always thought my dad was the model husband, someone who would never cheat. He was a strict Catholic and a respected member of the community. My friends and I used to joke about how dorky and chaste he was. He wouldn't even glance at another woman. Turns out it's because he was gay. I found out when I caught him watching adult content involving men, and later found inappropriate pictures and messages he had exchanged with young men, offering them money or concert tickets. Suddenly, my entire life made sense. Why he was never interested in women, why he didn't care for sports, why he loved theater and opera, and why he had mentorships with young men. I was furious that he had kept this secret and hurt my mom, so I confronted him, right in front of her. I regret doing that. I was young and confrontational, and it created a rift in our relationship. They stayed together, but their relationship was never the same. Both of them passed away from illness in their early 60s. My dad stayed by my mother's bedside every waking moment until she died, and he passed less than 2 years later. I know he loved her. I understand now why he kept his sexuality a secret. When he was unconscious in his last days, I flew in to be by his side. I asked for forgiveness and told him I loved and accepted him for who he was. I hope he heard me. He was a great dad. I miss them both terribly. Story 11. 1. My grandpa, who was a well-respected electrician before he died, intentionally left exposed wires in a man's $1 million home, knowing it would eventually catch fire. The man owned a ranch where my grandfather kept his horse. Sometimes he needed electrical work done at the ranch or his home, so Grandpa would take care of it. On the many visits they made, my grandpa and my dad, also an electrician, noticed a large cage in the man's living room. There were never any pets, but they found toys inside the cage more than once. This was back in a time when police needed more than suspicion to act, especially when the man could easily bribe his way out or claim that his son just played in the cage. Eventually, it came out that the man was selling clients' horses for profit and lying, saying the horses had been stolen during the night. My grandfather, a tough Italian man with ties to some dangerous people, was not someone to cross. When the man told my grandfather that his horse had been stolen and refused to involve the police, my grandfather did one final job at the house and left the exposed wires in the attic. Exposed wires spark eventually. 3 years later, the mansion burned to the ground. This was back in the day when it was harder to determine the exact cause of a fire, and the man had many other workers in and out of the property over that time. 2. My other grandfather, on my mom's side, had ongoing heart problems. After either his second or third heart attack, his doctor pulled my mom aside and told her that he had only a month left to live because his heart was so weak. At that point, his wife of over 40 years had been gone for about a decade, and his life had settled into a routine. Same food every day unless someone cooked for him, daily visits to the veterans bar, and rarely leaving the house. It wasn't that he didn't want to live. It was just very hard for him to go on without the person who had taken care of him since their 20s. My mom decided not to tell him. Why ruin his last month of life? Since it wasn't his first heart attack, it wasn't odd when my mom suggested getting his affairs in order. She didn't pressure him for everything, just enough so she'd know where to find what was needed when the time came. She told her siblings, and they all quietly said their goodbyes. Goodbyes that Grandpa never realized were final. He passed away exactly 1 month later, in his sleep. Story 12. Well, my great-aunt, she was with a man who owned a nightclub on a barge. I'm not sure where, but I could ask my dad. And apparently, she knew the ins and outs of the illegal activity that went on there. The family believes she and her partner were murdered for knowing too much, but I've always suspected he was involved in the illegal dealings too, because when they cleaned out her apartment, the entire couch was stuffed with bundles of cash and packages of illegal substances. My dad said the money funded a lifestyle the family had never dreamed of. We're from the rural South, and they grew up very poor. It was enough to connect my parents to a local criminal ring that supplied high-profile guests, including politicians, with drugs when celebrities came to town. There was a famous hotel they used, secluded at the top of a mountain. You could look down on the clouds from there. My mom still brags about partying with famous people behind my dad's back. I remember some of it too. A limo once came to pick her up. I don't know who the man was. Grandma said he was an author. But I remember it being strange. My mom has bipolar disorder and can be very unpredictable. Apparently, my brother and I were used as decoys during these runs. We were frequently transported with large quantities of drugs hidden under our car seats. I can remember the horse park where everything was unloaded. I don't recall much else, except that I hated my car seat. My life has not been simple. My godfather, who ran the operation, died in prison. He was married to a U.S. attorney. I never had a real childhood. Every photo of me as a baby shows me at a party. People wild and loud, and my brother and I sitting in diapers, on the floor or in someone's arms, surrounded by people who didn't care. My parents were both extremely self-centered. Our well-being as children was never a priority. We were tools of the trade. The business collapsed when I was 4. My parents divorced. My dad became a manager in the coal mines, and my mom still parties like crazy. She honestly resembles Ozzy Osbourne now. They're both a wild ride. My kids actually thought I was joking when I explained who my parents are. They thought my mom was my unruly sister and started calling my dad uncle. It just stuck. And there's more. After my grandma died, she was the sister of the aunt who was murdered. We discovered she had carried on a lifelong affair with a prominent local businessman, an associate in the original family drug business. We found out because of a box she'd hidden in her closet. It was full of expensive jewelry he'd given her, along with a diary. I was supposed to inherit the jewelry, but I refused. I loved my grandfather too much. He truly didn't deserve any of that. Every year, a flower arrangement still appears on her grave. It's disturbing, especially because she's buried next to the grandfather I worshipped. We even had to warn my little cousin because he unknowingly started dating the granddaughter of that businessman in high school. To this day, we're not even sure which of our aunts and uncles might actually be his. The lives my family chose were absurd. Story 13. My dad started cheating on my mom right from the day after the wedding, when he called his ex to assure her that his being married changed nothing. I first found out he was cheating when he gave me his phone, a Samsung Galaxy S4, which has forever afterward left bad impressions in my mind, so I could delete something since it was running slow. I somehow stumbled onto Viber, where it just opened on a messaging conversation with a contact named Elna Bai. I read some horribly graphic Sewell messages there. I was 13, and we were on a weekend escape to Greece, circling the Prespa Lake. I was horrified and held back from crying and speaking for the rest of the trip. I've never felt so betrayed and disgusted. That day left huge scars on my psyche, the extent of which I could hardly express. I contemplated ending my life or hurting my father for the next 3 years. I felt so sad for my mother, whom my dad beat and horribly mistreated. One day I actually begged her to leave him, but she wouldn't. I tried nihilism and felt despair to an unimaginable extent. I didn't even have any friends at the time, so I couldn't share it with anybody. I only had a brother, but after trying to somehow raise the subject, I got the sense that he was in on it. That just made everything so much worse. I decided to become the best person I could and help the world with all I can. Story 14. Well, after a serious bout of depression and severe anxiety, I found out that I am genetically predisposed to on both sides of the family, which, to be fair, when I was going through that, both my parents were very helpful and open about their experiences. But man, it would have been nice to know that beforehand. Funnily enough, the other family secret I know is that a great aunt of mine died by suicide. My mom was also close to her cousins, so this isn't some nameless relative. This is someone who was important in my mom's life. Coming from a Catholic family, the whole topic is a major taboo, so everyone, including her children, thinks it was a stroke. I don't know how my mom and aunt found out, but they know. I get that it's not really their place to reveal it, but again, it's one of those things that children should know to prepare themselves. I'm sure my mom would tell them if they weren't so deeply religious. Story 15. My grandfather was a stereotypical Irishman, falling down drunk constantly. A real embarrassment for everyone. No one talks about it or even admits it. My grandmother had a series of nervous breakdowns and had to be hospitalized. My 12-year-old mom had to take care of everyone, grandfather and 6 siblings, while Nana was in the psychiatric hospital. My mom definitely has mental health issues. She's a good person, but looking at it through my adult parent eyes, our childhood was bizarre and physically abusive. It was a different time, sure, but I can't imagine any circumstance that would prompt me to hit my kids, much less beat them the way my brother and I were, with belts, shoes, hands, etc. On the bright side, I wasn't a scared kid. I figured no one could hit harder than my mom, so I wasn't afraid to stand up for myself. I was a smaller kid, so that came in handy when others tried to bully me. Story 16. That everyone knew the man I thought was my father was not actually my father. I spent my entire childhood being coddled and babied and apparently pitied. Once I found out everyone had lied to me and I attempted to get to know my biological father, who ended up being a major disappointment, cool, my family immediately stopped talking to me and started saying awful things. They said I was ungrateful, just like my mother, and other cruel things. I wish I had never found out. It ruined my relationship with the people I loved the most. And yes, them abandoning me means they weren't who I thought they were. But I'd rather live in ignorance than deal with the nothingness I have now. The only family member who still talks to me, surprisingly, is my adoptive dad. And even he has become distant lately. Story 17. I got married within the last 2 years, but I've been with my husband for about a decade. We're in our early 20s, and we just found out that he has a half-sister about a decade older than he is. When his dad was in high school, he got his girlfriend pregnant, but he didn't know because she skipped town and didn't tell anyone. She didn't want anything from him, no child support or assistance, but she knew he was financially well off. He eventually left his small Colorado town for the East Coast, built a career, and married a wonderful woman. Meanwhile, the girl he got pregnant moved back to his hometown, where his entire extended family still lived. Eventually, they figured out who she was when she got older and started digging around. Small town, unique last names, easy connections. But they didn't tell him. He didn't find out until she contacted him directly in her 20s. He apologized, was shocked, offered her money and support to make up for the lost years. He's honestly a great guy. But ultimately, they both decided not to pursue a relationship. However, she had grown up an only child, and once she found out he had a son, my husband, through other relatives, she tracked us down through our wedding photos, which had family tags. She started reaching out, and it quickly felt obsessive and unsettling. I feel bad because I do understand where she's coming from, but it honestly scares me. My husband doesn't want anything to do with her, and I don't feel strongly about the relationship either way. We only found out because she reached out. Some relatives confirmed it and even tried to arrange a meetup when they came to town, without telling us. We had moved to a different part of the country by then. His parents still don't know that we know. Story 18. My mother was in denial that she was pregnant with me, as she was a party girl on the pill. Unfortunately, she didn't listen to her doctor when he told her the pill wouldn't work with the antibiotics she was taking for a bladder infection at the time. My grandmother, her mother who had 6 kids, told her she was pregnant, but she dismissed it until her next party, where she couldn't keep a drink down and the smell made her sick. Again, she was a party girl. Drinking was something she prided herself on. She went to the doctor when her flu wouldn't go away, and he brought her the good news about the stork coming. After I was born, my mother didn't even want to hold me. She didn't want my father's mother, who was thrilled to have a granddaughter, as she only had 2 boys and I was her first grandchild, to see me. She wouldn't let my father interact with me. She tried to give me to her mother to deal with, because it creeped her out that a newborn baby, who had no clue where they were or who anyone was, just stared at her when the nurse placed me in her arms after I was born. My family always described the whole affair as a gong show, but that's not the real secret, other than the fact that if my grandmother hadn't forced my mother to take responsibility for her actions and raise me, I would have been raised entirely by my grandparents. The true secret happened nearly 20 years later, when history nearly repeated itself. My mother started trying to reclaim her party girl persona about 10 years after she divorced my father, because she had cheated with another man who was, and still is, into drugs. Her stepfather had recently passed away, and she was having a hard time dealing with the grief over Papa's death. So she began drinking like a college student on summer break, neglected her son, my brother, whom I basically raised since my grandparents put their foot down when she tried to pawn him off on them too, and ended up with a man visiting from Australia who was backpacking through Canada and doing odd jobs until his visa expired. Well, her doctor had her on antibiotics again for another bladder infection caused by the heavy drinking. She hadn't had her tubes tied, but my father had gotten a vasectomy because they thought they'd stay together until menopause and didn't want more kids after my brother. You'd think she'd have learned to listen to her doctor about the pill not working while on medication, but no. She ended up having a miscarriage at the bar where I worked as the sole bartender at the time. I didn't know she was pregnant, but she did, and I had to call my grandmother to rush her to the hospital because I couldn't leave the bar, and she didn't want an ambulance. After my shift, I went to the hospital to figure out what had happened. Turns out she was pregnant, had drank through the pregnancy, and the baby didn't survive. Her plan, if the child had lived, was to have me raise it and even claim it was mine, because I was around the age she had me, and no one would bat an eye if I had a kid at 19 or 20. Even though I was casually seeing someone at the time, it would have been believable. I told her I wasn't going to raise my half-sister or half-brother as my own child just so she could go out and repeat the same pattern, especially not a child who might have special needs because she drank and used substances during pregnancy. I told her it wasn't my responsibility if she ended up having another baby in her 40s or 50s because she was acting like she was 16. She may have treated me like her sister 95% of the time growing up and forced me to raise her son since I was 7. But as a legal adult, I was willing to, and did, say no. Even if it would have broken my heart to watch that kid grow up in the same environment I did. My brother and my grandmother are the only ones who know this happened. But when she tried to get my brother to take care of her dog, which he didn't want, he told her to go take care of it herself. So I have no idea how he'd react if he found out he almost became an uncle to a half-sibling if she had gotten her way. Probably even more disappointed in her than he already is. Story 19. So, my great-grandmother was one of 8 siblings. She was the second oldest and one of 3 girls. Her youngest brother was born when she was 15. 2 years after his birth, their mother was assaulted and became pregnant with the attacker's child. She and her husband talked it over, and since his company had just gone bankrupt and they were dirt poor, they decided they couldn't afford another child. The baby was born, a girl named Celia, and she was put up for adoption. The family didn't hear from her for 19 years. Then things got complicated. My great-grandmother's youngest brother started dating a girl who was 2 years younger than him. He brought her to their father's funeral. She met all of the siblings. When they asked her name, she said it was Celia. They laughed at the coincidence, saying that their parents had once put a baby girl named Celia up for adoption 19 years ago. She replied that she was adopted and she was 19. That's when my family started to panic a little. They looked deeper into adoption records and ran some DNA tests, and sure enough, she was their long-lost sister. But now the situation became delicate. The two were in love. Technically, since they had grown up apart and weren't raised as siblings, there was no legal or biological prohibition. So they decided to stay together. They married and had 3 children, a strange, unlikely love story that lasted. This was a tightly kept family secret until about 2 years ago, when my grandmother had a bit too much wine and let it slip. It's still not openly discussed. Celia and my great-grandmother's brother passed away a long time ago in a house fire. Their children were already adults by then, and we don't hear from them anymore. They live abroad and are much older now. Story 20. Over the years, I've been learning that my dad has witnessed a lot. For example, he worked in a steel factory 50 to 60 years ago, and while he was there, someone fell into molten steel while his son watched. Another time, someone was transporting molten steel with a machine where the seat was above the engine, and the steel spilled. The engine exploded. The man suffered burns over 90% of his body and had internal bleeding. As a paramedic, my dad was one of the first responders at the Lockerbie bombing. which he described as the eeriest silence he'd ever experienced. He once responded to a farmer who had taken his own life using a double-barreled shotgun at close range. He also responded to a prisoner who had been slashed across the eye. He came dangerously close to being attacked by overdosed individuals after reversing their highs. Many didn't take kindly to being pulled back to reality. On a lighter note, he has safely delivered many babies, including my sister. He once successfully resuscitated a baby who wasn't breathing and also revived a man's father. When that father passed years later, my dad even attended his funeral. Even after retirement, he has helped a young boy hit by a car until the ambulance arrived. He's provided first aid to my nephews when they were hurt, to a neighbor's baby when she fell and hit her head, and to that same neighbor again during a seizure. One morning, another neighbor was found unconscious and my dad helped his friends call emergency services. Sadly, that man had passed hours before, likely due to a brain aneurysm. The man's family and friends were Polish and spoke very little English. My dad was the only one able to help. He was also the only one who believed me when no one else would, and correctly recognized that my arm was broken. Story 21. Maybe it doesn't count for this question, but I kept my severe mental illness a secret from my entire family, and almost everyone I know, for over 20 years. That's 2 decades of privately dealing with unbearable anguish, constant despair, and a persistent urge to end my life that never really goes away. On the outside, I wore a mask of normalcy. I was high-functioning, successful at work, earned an honors degree in nanotechnology, had loving relationships and amazing friends who would do anything for me. I was the favorite brother and an idolized uncle to 10 incredible nieces and nephews. But behind the mask, I was and still am a slow-motion train wreck. As the years went on, the mask became too heavy to hold. Things spiraled. Eventually, I had myself committed to a psychiatric hospital for a week. The only person I ever confided in, my ex-girlfriend and eternal best friend, picked me up and finally convinced me to tell my family. That was literally about 10 days ago. Hearing my diagnosis and learning about the decades of private suffering has shaken my family. The outpouring of support has been overwhelming. I'm probably more miserable right now than before because of the shame and embarrassment. Even writing this took me 2 hours. But I do feel a small amount of relief too. Story 22. My grandma was a nun. She met my grandpa in her late 30s while chaperoning a dance. He was younger than her. She left the convent for him and had my uncle, aunt, and mother in her late 30s or early 40s. This was considered pretty disgraceful at the time. My aunt got drunk at my 18th birthday party and blurted all of this out. Her husband, me, my siblings, and cousins, we had no idea, but that wasn't the real secret. My mom's brother died in his 50s, and on the day of his funeral, their sister, my aunt, started ranting. She told us that when my grandma was a nun, she first worked at a Magdalene laundry. My grandma had always said there was a 4th sibling, but never elaborated. They assumed it was a miscarriage. My aunt didn't get to say much more that day because she was pulled away to the bathroom where she fell down a single step and got injured. Everyone was upset and the whole scene was brushed aside. Now my uncle was the oldest, my aunt was a year younger, and my mom is 6 years younger than either, so she had no idea what her sister was talking about. By that point, my grandparents were already gone. Nothing else was said about it until I was staying at my aunt's house, the one who had ranted. A news segment came on about a Magdalene laundry. They had exhumed an unmarked graveyard full of infants. The site had even partially been redeveloped into a children's playground. I didn't know much about the Magdalene laundries before, only vague mentions. But the news explained more. Some of the babies had been labeled as dead and sent to U.S. adoption agencies. Others had been neglected, and some were victims of serious mistreatment. The women, too. These were places where unwed mothers, often teens, were sent. Their babies were taken from them. They were shamed, hidden away, forced to labor, and cut off from visitors. I asked my aunt about it. She said nothing. Later after dinner, she had wine and saw me trying to discreetly look up information about the laundries and my grandmother's possible involvement. She began talking about it again. She said she never got to meet her sibling, doesn't even know if they're alive or dead, and that she had tried to look into it but found nothing. That kind of information is often locked away. My grandma was a nervous woman, polite, deeply religious, always praying, but it was like she feared God more than loved him. I don't know if that makes sense. The topic was never brought up again. One time my mom caught me watching a historical film based on the Magdalene laundries and shut it off. She was furious. Said it was slander to suggest anything like that about her mother, that it was disrespectful, and that my aunt was crazy. She acknowledged it was a tragic piece of history, but insisted my grandmother had no part in it. Is it true? I have no idea. But it makes sense. My cousins agree with me, but none of us wants to be the one to bring it up with our mothers. Still, it sticks with me. Those places ran for centuries. The last one closed in 1996, less than a year before my cousin and I were born. My dad's side has even more stories. Shady, dangerous, illegal stuff involving the IRA. So I'm sure there's a lot more I'll never know. Story 23. My great-grandfather was the village pastor in southern Germany. He was well-liked, charitable, and always caring for the poor. He opposed the Nazis and acted against them, publicly condemning them in his sermons, disrupting their rallies, and holding church services during their events so no one would attend. He continued this until the local SA leader made it clear that his defiance would no longer be tolerated, even though he was the village priest. Eventually, his family was threatened. 3 of his 7 biological children, they had taken in an 8th, an orphan, ended up being strong Nazi supporters. One of them, my great-uncle, was especially outspoken. After all, he grew up on a steady diet of propaganda through school and the Hitler Youth. Eventually, my great-grandfather couldn't even speak freely in his own home. He feared his children would report him to the Gestapo. My great-uncle became more deeply involved with the local Nazi organizations. There was a quarry nearby where forced labor was used, those labeled as undesirables. Roma people, communists, social democrats, Jewish people, Jehovah's Witnesses. When it became clear that the war was lost and the Americans were approaching, the German troops had already withdrawn. One night, all the remaining prisoners were executed, about 15 people in total. A guerrilla group of devoted Nazis, known as the werewolves, claimed responsibility. My great-uncle disappeared the very next day. He was last seen that night with a few important local Nazi figures. For months, he was missing. Rumors said he was hiding on a farm in the nearby mountains. Long after the war ended, only one person was ever sentenced to a few years in prison for those murders. But no one believed he acted alone. The whole village knew who the group of young men were that vanished after that night, hiding from the Americans. My great-uncle went on to become a loving father and everyone's favorite relative. He died at 87, working in the garden he loved, and he was a mass murderer. Story 24. My grandmother was one of 6 children. When she was around 10, her father left, taking 3 of the kids with him. My grandmother was one of the 3 left behind with her mother. Her father died 8 years later. Her mother always told her that he had taken the smart and pretty children and left her because she was ugly and useless. She believed that for her entire life. A few years ago, one of her siblings found a safe that had belonged to my great-grandmother. Inside were letters from my grandmother's father, one written every single week during those 8 years, begging to be allowed to see my grandmother and the 2 other children he had left behind. It turned out he had intended to return for them after initially taking the others, but my great-grandmother refused to allow it. She had been having an affair, and she used the children as leverage to extract money from him. He dutifully sent both funds and letters. Imagine being in your 80s and discovering that your entire life was built on a lie. Story 25. My grandfather was the 6th in command of the Hongman's Singapore branch and had strong ties to politicians and celebrities across the Sinosphere. He knew things that most people didn't. For instance, 2 of our former heads of state allegedly hired triad members on multiple occasions to break up protests, intimidate demonstrators, and pressure political rivals. Bruce Lee was also reportedly disliked by traditional martial arts instructors and parts of the underworld. They allegedly called him a traitor to blood for revealing cultural secrets to outsiders and rarely invited him to martial arts gatherings. Once, a local street gang tried to extort money from vendors up and down a street, kicking over several stalls into an open drain. According to family stories, my grandfather summoned a lorry full of men to escort these hooligans to him. When they arrived, he supposedly said something like, "You think by being loud and rude, you own this street? Even if you control this country, never forget that we, the Hong men, control the world." Then he handed them over to the police. Story 26. I figured out years ago that my dad wasn't just going on all those trips to South America and the Caribbean for leisure. Over time, it became pretty obvious that he was running drugs. He had a big sailboat that he used, and sometimes he'd travel with friends who owned private planes. This was during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He had bins full of cash and always carried a thick roll of $100 bills in his pocket. I remember once coming home and seeing 3 brand new Mercedes parked in the driveway. I hinted that I'd like to have one, and he turned to me and said, "They're not presents. They're payment." I also remember how just mentioning his name could get me out of trouble or earn favors, like free services. People would say, "Oh, you're so-and-so's kid. The oil change is on us. Tell him we said hello." It was like that everywhere. Eventually, he got caught bringing drugs in, but they only found a small amount. I guess they had ditched most of it. He ended up getting a slap on the wrist and seemed to cool it after that. About 5 years ago, he moved to Medellin, Colombia, and hasn't come back since. He said people were after him, probably owed someone money or something. Story 27. My dad's side of the family, mostly sheriffs, had a long-standing rivalry with a professional crime group on the East Coast. My great-grandfather was killed when starting his car, and one of my uncles was run off the road on his motorcycle. Several others were shot, but the feud seemed to end with my grandfather. My great-grandparents had a large Catholic family with lots of extended relatives. During that time, they also imprisoned and killed their fair share of criminals. But my dad didn't follow that path. He joined the military instead. He's never talked about my grandfather, who also died young, also from a car explosion. I didn't learn any of this until I went to my grandmother's funeral 4 years ago. That's when I discovered we have a large family gravesite in the middle of a major city. A great uncle, whom I met for the first time, gave me a tour and shared some of the stories. I found out he had become a millionaire and even served as mayor during the feud. He's still doing well and owns several blocks of houses. It makes me wonder what else I haven't been told. I once found an old photo of my great-grandfather, grandfather, his brother, and a few others holding rifles in front of an old Model T-style car. There was also a box with old police tools, handcuffs, a billy club, finger restraints, and a stack of paperwork. I was too young when I found it, and I never read the documents. I never saw that box again after my dad caught me playing with the billy club. Story 28. My brother and sister have a different father than I do, but they're younger, and my dad raised all of us. Apparently, my biological dad was deported before my mom even realized she was pregnant with me. After I was born, she moved on. There wasn't really any way to know if my dad was even alive. Plus, he didn't know I existed. And back in the 90s, she couldn't exactly track him down easily. Honestly, I don't even think she knew his real name at that point. Fast forward 5 years, and 2 more kids later, my dad showed up again and vowed to raise me, no matter what. Even if that meant raising 2 children that weren't his. I wish I had known all this growing up, because I carried a lot of resentment as a kid. It always felt like he was easier on my siblings. I think he just had sympathy for them since they didn't know their fathers. People constantly told us we couldn't be related. I looked Mexican, and my siblings looked white, so they assumed we weren't family. I only found out the truth when my grandma told me after I turned 18. I now have a newfound respect for my dad. He didn't have to step up for them, but he did, and I'm grateful he gave them the father they needed. Story 29. Fairly recently, I learned that my great-great-grandfather used to regularly abuse his daughter, my great-great-aunt. This continued for years, and even though she told her brothers, they didn't believe her, and even tried to blame her for what was happening. I've struggled to come to terms with this, because one of those brothers, my great-grandfather, was a pastor and highly respected in his community. His own wife knew about what had happened and tried to convince him it was true. She wouldn't leave their daughters out of her sight when he was around. My Nana, who was my great-grandfather's 3rd child, tried to talk to him about it over the years. It was only a few days before he passed away in the hospital that he finally admitted it wasn't his sister's fault and that their father was in the wrong. But by then it was too late. His sister had died unmarried, having lived her whole life thinking her brothers believed she was lying and somehow responsible for what happened to her. On the other side of the family, I also have an uncle by marriage who had his computer seized by the FBI for possessing highly inappropriate material involving children. Every year I get grief from my childless siblings for not wanting to visit during the holidays, as if I would want my kids anywhere near him. They're too young to remember, but after our house caught fire, we stayed with that uncle and my aunt for a short while. He used to insist on helping us wash ourselves and even tried to start an affair with my mother. We moved out pretty quickly after that. Story 30. I'm sure this will get lost in the comments, but my aunt and uncle met at a family reunion, and they're deeply ashamed of it. I'm also pretty sure there's a deeper, darker secret within the family. My mom and that aunt, they're sisters, had a major falling out when I was growing up. Every year, my mom's siblings would go on a family camping trip. My family never joined them. I would sometimes go along by tagging along with my aunt and uncle. I always asked my mom why we never went, and she said it was because my aunt got angry that she had bought the wrong kind of hash browns, cubes instead of shredded. Hash browns? That seemed like a legitimate reason when I was a kid, but now it just feels way too suspicious. Later on, I found out that my uncle, who is married to that same bitchy aunt, did something to my other aunt, the youngest sibling in the family, something against her will. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but she confided in me a bit. She confronted the aunt, and the aunt completely lost it. She denied that her husband could ever do anything wrong. I now strongly suspect that the real reason for the falling out between my mom and that aunt had nothing to do with frozen potatoes and everything to do with protecting someone. Looking back, I think my mom pulled our family from those trips because my oldest sister was close in age to the aunt who made the accusation, and she used the hash browns as a cover story. To this day, that aunt still resents her younger sister. It's heartbreaking because the youngest has a lot of mental and physical issues, and I'm sure this traumatic event plays a big role in all of that. Story 31. My mom was doing some research one day on my dad's maternal side. My grandmother, his mom, had passed about 5 years earlier when she noticed someone had added some new information to the family tree. Curious, she dug deeper to figure out who was contributing and what the details were when she received an anonymous message. The message revealed a long-hidden family secret. My grandma had given birth to a daughter out of wedlock in April of 1947 in Vallejo, California. She had been sent to a home for unwed mothers, and the baby was placed for adoption. My grandma later married a different man, my grandfather, a year afterward and started a new family. She never told anyone, not even her children, about the daughter she had given up. It turns out that the person who messaged my mom on Ancestry.com was the daughter of that long-lost sister. So not only did my dad discover he had a half-sister, but I found out I had two first cousins I'd never known existed, and they had both been adopted from Russia in the early 90s. Pretty wild. My dad ended up having an incredibly emotional phone call with the sister he never knew existed. She later flew up from Southern California to meet all of us in Seattle. Fast forward to today, she and her daughters have become a big part of our lives and have since moved to the Seattle area to be closer to us. They're amazing women, and I still can't believe that if my mom hadn't signed up for Ancestry.com, we might never have known about any of this. It's pretty mind-blowing. Story 32. When I was 10, my grandfather on my dad's side passed away. While he was dying, he told my dad and uncle that he wished he had gotten to see his firstborn son grow up. My uncle, who thought he was the firstborn, responded by saying that he had been there all along. But my grandfather looked at him and said, "You're not my firstborn." At the funeral, my dad and uncle spoke with some of my grandfather's World War II buddies. That's when they learned the truth. While stationed in Japan after the war, my grandfather had fathered a child. None of us had ever heard about it before. We also found out that the reason he had volunteered for World War II in the first place was because he'd been in prison for shooting someone. He was offered clemency if he agreed to enlist. On the other side of the family, things are just as complicated. After my grandmother on my mother's side passed away, we learned she had been married twice before having my mom and aunt. And it's possible they don't share the same father. They've refused to take DNA tests to find out. Even more twists emerged after my mom's biological father died. He had been mostly absent from her life after she turned 10. That's when she learned that his mother had an affair with a judge somewhere in upstate New York. These affairs and hidden marriages explain a lot about my 23andMe results, which showed family connections that don't align with the surnames I expected. Story 33. My great-uncle was a gun runner for the IRA. Back in the 1970s, my mom moved from a small village in the countryside to Belfast to attend school. She stayed with her aunt and uncle, who already lived in the city. Her aunt was outspoken in her political beliefs, but her uncle was different, quiet, kind, and always helping others. He never spoke badly about anyone or seemed involved in politics at all. He made a living by collecting scrap metal with a cart and doing deliveries for neighbors. When he came across British soldiers while on his rounds, he would stop to chat, asking them if they missed home or how their families were doing. Because of his friendliness, no one ever suspected a thing. He was never searched. Years later, my mom was attending a distant cousin's funeral and started chatting with another cousin. They began reminiscing about her uncle, and the cousin casually mentioned something that made her pause. When she pressed him for more details, he said, "Ah, sure your uncle moved more guns around Belfast than the British Army. He had been storing weapons under the floorboards of the house and transporting them hidden under junk on his cart. Broad daylight, right under the noses of soldiers, and no one thought twice because he was so polite and trustworthy." That was the moment my mom realized that during the 3 years she lived with him, she had been sleeping in a house filled with weapons. Under the surface of kindness and quiet demeanor, he had been running firearms for one of the most notorious movements in Irish history. Story 34. My grandmother was the result of her mother being assaulted. She never knew who her biological father was. She had several siblings, 2 sisters and a brother, I believe, who were all the children of her mother and her husband. My great-grandmother kept and loved my grandmother, but her husband, the man she was raised to believe was her father, was abusive toward her. He seemed to resent her existence. Eventually, my great-grandmother left him and took all her children with her, choosing to raise them on her own. My mom and her sisters have always been frustrated that no one would tell my grandmother anything about her real father, even though it seems like a few family members knew. Her sister apparently knew who he was, but refused to ever say, even after my grandmother begged her to tell. One of her aunts even said outright that she knew, but would never reveal it. The belief is that it may have been a family friend, someone known to my great-grandmother before it happened, but we really don't know. I didn't find any of this out until after my grandmother had passed. She went through so much in her life, but she remained loving and generous and always wanted the best for her family. I truly wish she had been able to find out the truth about her father, even if he had been a terrible person, and there is some speculation as to whether it was truly an assault or if there had been a consensual relationship my great-grandmother later tried to hide. It's still something she deserved to know. As far as we're aware, the incident was never reported, but it was a different time. There are many pieces of this story that may remain unknown forever. Story 35. I found out not long ago that my parents lied to almost everyone in our family, except my mom's parents, about where we lived for several years during my childhood. The story goes that they had bought one house, House A, and shortly after wanted to buy another, House B, as a rental property. But there were some legal issues. Apparently, they needed to be living in House B to qualify for a specific type of mortgage. They also didn't want the rest of the family to know they had borrowed money from my mom's dad to afford the second house. They were afraid other relatives might start asking him for loans if word got out. So while growing up, I remembered living in both houses at different times, but the family was told we only lived in House A. My parents would switch between the houses from time to keep up the illusion that they were living in House B as required. I was between 3 and 6 years old, so I didn't understand any of it at the time, just that I lived in 2 places. A few years ago, we were at a family dinner and I casually mentioned something about living in House B. My mom gave me the kind of look that instantly said I wasn't supposed to talk about it, and she quickly changed the subject. After the dinner, my parents pulled me aside and told me the full story. Apparently, nobody was ever supposed to know about the second house, due to both financial and legal complications, but no one had ever bothered to tell me to keep it quiet. Story 36. When my grandmother passed away a couple of years ago, my family was going through her home and discovered a sealed box with my grandfather's name written on it in his handwriting. He had died before I was born, and the box looked like it hadn't been opened in decades, dusty and sealed with layers of tape. Inside were newspaper clippings and documents that revealed a story no one in our family had ever heard. Apparently, back in the early 1900s, when my grandfather was in his late teens, he took a road trip with some friends to see the ocean. While there, their car was stolen. With no transportation and nothing holding them back, they decided to stay for a while and earn some money. During that time, my grandfather met a young woman from Mexico and married her within a month. There were articles in the box, one about the stolen car, another announcing their wedding, and even a marriage certificate. No one in the family had ever known about this. We couldn't find any more information on what happened next. We don't know if they married for love or if it was for immigration purposes, or if they had children, and we don't know whether he was legally divorced before marrying my grandmother in the 1930s.